Okay, I'd like to begin, as I do every time, by thanking Dave Whelan and the Talbot Spy for creating this wonderful partnership with the Talbot County Free Library that gives me the opportunity to speak with some terrific writers and poets. To tell you a little bit about my guest today, I got to start with a story. Almost 2 years ago now, I think I was flying home to Kentucky, and a gentleman sat down next to me on the plane, and we got to talking. And when he found out I was a writer, he said, "Well, you know, my daughter's a poet." And I smiled. You know, a lot of people have daughters who are poets. A lot of people think they're poets. And in my experience, it's unfortunately true that they rarely are. But I was nice, and I gave him my card, and I said, "Well, I would love to read her poetry someday." And shortly thereafter, I started an email correspondence with his daughter, Joy Priest, who's my guest today. And shortly after that, Joy sent me an email saying that her first book of poetry, which I have right here, Horsepower, was coming out, and it had already won the Donald Hall Prize for Poetry. Now, I got to tell you, in case you don't know, the Donald Hall Prize for Poetry is one of the biggest prizes that is given every year in poetry, and this was her first book. I was blown away. And that's not all she's done. That was in 2019. It won the Donald Hall Prize. This year, one of her poems won the American Poetry Review's Stanley Kunitz Prize for Poetry, which is also a big one. That was for A Personal History of Breathing. Her poetry has appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, Poetry Northwest, Poets and Writers, ESPN, the Louisville Anthology. I should stop here and say that Joy and I are both from Louisville, Kentucky, and so you will hear us pronounce it Louisville. But in reality, of course, you all are thinking, wait a minute, is that Louisville? Okay, so when I say Louisville, I mean Louisville. She's been published in Best New Poets of 2014, 2016, and 2019, and A Measure of Belonging, Writers of Color on the New American South. Joy has received support from the Fine Arts Work Center, the Frost Place, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and the Hurston Wright Foundation. She has worked as a journalist, theater attendant, waitress, and fast food worker. She's facilitated workshops and arbitration programs with adult and juvenile incarcerated women. And Joy is currently a doctoral student in literature and creative writing at the University of Houston. Joy Priest, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm so excited to be talking with you.
I'm hoping, I would like to start, if you don't mind, by asking you to read the title poem from Horsepower so people can get a feel for just how powerful your work really is.
All right. I appreciate that pronunciation of Louisville. You'll tell someone how to say it and they'll still argue with you. Like, you mean Louisville? You mean Louisville? Louisville. This is a title poem of the collection Horsepower. Horsepower. Off season, before the racetrack opens, I jump through the threshold of my back door stable side. A dove takes off from its nest tucked into the corner of the porch awning, glides through my world, which I can see in its entirety from my top step. The twin steeples and emerald roofs just past our garage. A horse practicing its start out of the gate. Only Longfield, that avenue rounding the perimeter of the pill-shaped track, where the red and white and green flags ripple from balconies, and my neighbors sell horchata in styrofoam cups, street tacos in paper baskets with cilantro and lime. Only Longfield and a chain link fence separates the horse's air from mine. They work the loop of that circular mile, making everyone's living except their own, the motors of our economy. Beyond the spires is a larger world I do not know exists. A mile west in my line of vision is a family I do not know I have. In that corner of the city, separating from the land like a cell in mitosis, straining across the Ohio River to the north, my great aunt, Black matriarch, rocks on her blue porch, and my father, just a couple of blocks away from her, coos my baby brother into sleep, while his new wife flowers the wings of a flightless bird. But all I know for now is my grandfather, the white one, And I know my mother, who I can hear now roaring home from work in her muscle car. And wait, I know the horses and their restless minds.
Oh wow, that's just fabulous. I love that poem. And the idea of the mitosis of that peninsular Louisville slipping out into the Ohio River like that. I never really thought about that before, but it does. It's nice. One of the things I love about your poetry, and this poem's a good example of this, is that unlike a lot of modern poetry, your poems, most of them tell a story, and actually your book tells a series of stories. It reads almost like a novel. The Horsepower has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And by the end of it, we know a lot about you and your circumstances. How intentional was that?
So I'm really excited that recently in like reviews of the book or just people like making posts about it, that they speak of it as sort of like a novel in verse or narrative in that way. I mean, because in recent years in poetry, it feels like if you're writing narrative poetry, you're kind of like not a great poet. There's this sort of like elitism about being a lyric poet, And of course, there's Maurice Manning from Kentucky who wins a Pulitzer and writes narrative and in common speech. But that's sort of like those are sort of outliers when that happens. And so I was really happy this morning to learn that the book was nominated for the John Leonard First Book Prize from the National Book Critics Circle Award. And that's one of the first things that the reviewer says is she talks about like its narrative grace and how like a story is written through poems. And so I wasn't necessarily, I'm a fan of, my favorite genre is short fiction. I love short stories. I think I was writing those as a kid. I just remember like in first grade, my teacher giving me a side project to write a short story. I love short stories, but I don't think that's what my intentions were with this book. I was actually thinking more about cinema. I was actually thinking about writing a cinematic narrative. And so the structure is intentional in that I was using the conventions of cinema to come into the story in media res, into the action. And so I don't know, I guess that sort of informed the structure of the book. Yeah.
Well, and it is, I hadn't thought about that until you said it, but it is very cinematic. There's a real visual sense to all your storytelling, which I like a lot. I'm a visual kind of a guy. Have you, and explain to me, you said narrative as opposed to lyrical poetry. Is that what you said? What's lyrical poetry? I mean, I would have said your poetry is very lyrical.
Well, I was about to say, I think it's sort of a false dichotomy, but because I get that as well. I get like it's narrative and lyrical, but I think it's pretty strongly narrative. I don't know. I think when I teach it, and because of the feedback I've gotten, I've sort of come to think of it. I don't feel like there's any static definitions in poetry. I feel like everyone is using these words, and no one really has like an agreed upon definition about what they mean. Everyone just kind of like is having a conversation with what they think that the other person means, and they probably have a totally different definition. But I don't know. I think I understand. My personal understanding of it is, narrative has a sort of the standard convention of telling a story that we use, that our society kind of follows in movies and stories and like how to tell a story, a beginning, middle, and end, a chronology, teleological progression, and that sort of thing. But I think lyric poetry, obviously is a holdover from the lyric, which is informed by music and prosody and so forth. But I think also it's defined less by a narrative structure and more so is usually rendered as a series of images or a series of sensory, sensorial language or, something, but not really something that tells a story. It can be elliptical as well. So
Sure. Well, that leads sort of into my next question. Your language is so beautiful in your poetry. Have you always been in love with language? Were you aware of language as a child?
Oh, I think so. My memory is so bad. I think that's mainly why I write poetry now, is I'm trying to remember things. But I do remember, well, I was the spelling bee champ like 3 years in a row.
Whoa.
4th and 5th grade. I went to the district spelling bee and I was placed 3rd in the district and everything. So I must have loved words, but mostly I loved reading. I still love reading more than writing. And so I think I just was always like, it's really kind of like self-serving. I just always was like wanting people to love me and be impressed with me. And I would always have a new word, like, look what I can spell. I remember like telling people I wanted to be an archaeologist simply because I knew how to spell archaeologist. And I and I knew as a kid, people would ask me if I could spell it, And so I don't know. I think I'm just obsessed with knowing things, and like words are a part of that. But obviously I love language, and not just English, I love translating, and I love other languages and hearing other languages and learning things about other languages. So I guess so.
Good for you. And I love the fact that that reading is you enjoy even more than writing. I work for the library here. They call me the library guy in Talbot County, and I'm always trying to get people to read more. And someone once asked Virginia Woolf how she managed to write a book. And they were saying, it's impossible to be able to write that well. And she said, read 1,000 books and the words will flow like a river. It really is true. Reading just makes all the difference in the world.
Can I say?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, one, librarians are my favorite people in the world. And two, when I'm teaching composition, and sometimes like students will be like, well, how can I learn how to write better? And I'm like, this isn't going to be the answer you want, but literally reading is how you learn how to write. It's how you understand mechanics. You just sort of like osmosis them when you read a lot, and I even notice it during the semester when I'm like reading more for school, that academic, it also informs the kinds of writing you do. So if I'm reading more academic texts, I notice I have more fluidity writing academically. Whereas if I'm reading more like literary stuff, I have more fluidity with that. So
exactly. Yeah. And I found that similarly, if I'm stuck on something, I'm having trouble writing something I need to write, if I read something in a similar vein, it helps me budge loose. Well, another part of your poetry that being from Louisville, I really enjoy is geography. The geography of your hometown and mine, Louisville, is an important part of your poetry. It seems to me. I think it's more than just backdrop. Can you tell us about that?
Man, so this is like the most common question I've been getting after readings and in interviews, but mostly like right after the readings with the Q&A. And I didn't really know how to talk about that at first. Like mostly it's like, can you talk about place in your work? You're such a writer of place. And I was like, really? I thought people, I thought this was just like par for the course. Like people were informed by like where they're from, and apparently not so much. But I also think too, the particular narrative in the book is cannot be divorced from the geography of the city in which it takes place. I mean, it's particularly the racial demographics, the racial geography of the city. And I've talked about this a little bit in a Q&A with my press, but Louisville, a lot of people, Louisville's not a place I feel that's in the national imagination or the national consciousness. so there was a bit of a drive for me to sort of write the mythology of Louisville. And because it is, I mean, it's just, to me, it's like, I mean, I'm sure everyone feels like this, but to me, it's like it's crucial to the national story. And so, and it hasn't really been mythologized really well yet. I mean, you have Hunter S. Thompson, who wrote about the Kentucky Derby, but, you know, the literary legacy of Kentucky as a whole is rich. But I mean, in terms of Louisville, I don't know, maybe I'm ignorant about it, but I just, you know, so I felt, and particularly as a young person of color, like growing up there, I often felt like I was living in obscurity. It's not one of those places that has like a train or like some way to get out, or like, you know, it's kind of like this landlocked place where I mean, we have a river, but, you know, so I think in that way is the geography of the city informed me writing about place, but also it's the fourth most segregated city in the country after Detroit, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. And just doing that kind of research, I really wanted to sort of point out these landmarks that I experienced as growing up as a person, like in the in-between of those segregated spaces, you know. And so,
and it is very much an in-between sort of a city when you think about it. It's in the South, but it's right on the border, boy. I mean, right across the river is Indiana.
Yeah, that liminality is thematic. You know, it's like it's Southern, but it's Midwestern. It's Southern, but it's a Union state. It's you know, historically there's so much there that makes it an in between. It was the frontier, but it was like, you know, and it's just, it doesn't really fit neatly into anything, which also parallels the speaker in the collection as well, right?
Sure. Oh yeah, I think we can all identify with not fitting in well.
Well,
next question. I try to avoid asking really personal questions about people on this program, mainly because I don't want to make you feel like you got to talk about something you may not want to. But your poetry strikes me as being so autobiographical, almost confessional, that I hope it's okay for me to say, am I right, first of all, that it is autobiographical? And how was that a struggle for you? You share some fairly intimate and sometimes difficult things about your family and friends. Was that hard for you? And what was the effect upon them? Well,
I give people trouble about this, which is that I say poetry is not nonfiction and it's not fiction. You know, it's its own genre. And maybe it's more like mythology and song, you know, and so I think, like, you know, there are those singers that, you know, I'm thinking maybe about like Fleetwood Mac or what's the woman that sung like, you probably think this song is about you.
Yeah, that's who is that? God, I can't think of her name. I know it. Who is that? Oh well, so someone will tell us after this show goes on the air.
Someone will know too who's listening. Yeah. But there's always speculation about whether these songs were autobiographical, or there's mythology about personal things happening behind them, which I think is okay. But I think with poetry, you don't ever want to assume it's completely autobiographical. Like, there's world building, there's mythology making, there's details that are not autobiographically factual, but still true for the narrative. And then in the second poem in the book, I actually named my speaker. So I would say that it's based on my personal experiences, you know. Mm-hmm. And my personal stories certainly did inform the narrative in the collection. When I was putting it together in the late stages, revision and ordering and stuff like that, I would talk to my parents on the phone in the evenings for hours, like just interviewing them about stuff. So they were pretty engaged. They were pretty engaged in that part of the process and aware of, and you know, they're my like first listeners and things like that. So I don't know, that I don't know. My parents aren't necessarily artists. I think they could have been if they had different circumstances growing up. But I also think they just come from a time where I don't know, 'cause that's not true either. My mother was kind of a hippie though, and then my dad is just he's an enigma. He's just like, he's weird and artistic, even though he's like, that's not his profession. So I just think that, they get it, and they're proud of the book, and they understand that the story is really important for like our larger society, I think.
Good. That. I'm glad to hear that. And moving on to other characters in the book, as the title would indicate, horses of all things play an important role in the book. And being from Kentucky, of course, I love horses. It makes me very happy. Can you tell us a little bit about why you did that?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up the first few years of my life, I lived on the backside of the racetrack, Churchill Downs, where they run the Kentucky Derby every year. And horses were just like a part of my sensory environment. Like, I smelled them mostly, I saw them, I heard them. And so I think that they were just they were deep in my subconscious, and they started to emerge as a conceit when I was putting together the book. And but it's not just like horses. I also like at one point I was reading the Iliad, and I read the part where like I think I can't remember Achilles' friend who takes care of them, that they have a close relationship with, but he's slain, and then they weep, and the gods actually like have mercy on them, but not humans.
Is it Hector?
Huh?
Is it Hector?
No, I think is it
I can't remember. It doesn't matter. It's the one who wrote that song. I'll bet you think this song is about me. Sorry, go ahead.
But anyways, like, they're immortal. The horses are immortal, and they're weeping, and so the gods are like, "What the hell, is going on? Who hurt these horses?" And I don't know, something about that just made me think like, yeah, this is like part of the mythology of Louisville, and but also I was in writing a book that's about escaping, and in writing a book that's about like working class socioeconomics and things like that. I felt like muscle cars and flight and all this stuff, like it was a multi-resonant metaphor, the horse.
Sure.
So
It certainly works really well throughout the novel. Throughout the book. Every time the word pops up, horses, it fits perfectly. I go, oh yes, she nailed that one. I really liked it. And this we've already talked for, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes, and it's interesting. And I noticed this when I was writing up the questions for this interview. I'd already been working for about half an hour, and I realized I haven't mentioned race once in any of these questions. And race actually is an important part of your poetry. And so, but it didn't really surprise me that I hadn't written any questions about it yet, because while race is an important part of your poetry, it seems to me at least that it doesn't dominate your poetry. It doesn't overpower it. Race is always something that exterior, something that's being done to you by someone else, or being done to someone by someone else. But your poetry, I think, is bigger than that. It's universal, it seems to me, and you don't have to. I don't think one would have to be a Black or an ethnic minority to enjoy and appreciate your poetry. But maybe I'm way off on that. What do you think? Am I wrong?
Maybe I guess I would frame it as race isn't the difficulty or the thing, the central thing. It just is, I just am Black. It's racism that is the difficulty. And that when I do speak about it when I am bringing up race explicitly, it's usually it's usually addressing some form of racism, right? And because race is kind of I think it's just inherent. It's just, I don't like, there's no need for me to like explicitly perform race, Blackness in these different ways. it's just kind of like a part of the geography, a part of the environment, a part, those sort of things. Like, because I think that you can get into, these things are always so tense to talk about. You can get into like a kind of writing where there becomes a demand for you as an explicitly political writer to always write explicitly about these things. And I think for me, it's more important to show that it actually is central to an American story, but not in this explicit way. It's just, it actually, I don't know, because I often talk about race as not a peripheral American problem. Racism is not a peripheral like problem. Like, oh, we got to worry about the economy, and then we got to worry about race over here. I like think about it as central to all of those different things, or having a role in all those different things. And so I think if I were to write about it so it politically explicit, it would start to be like sort of this separate problem over here that it feels like something that I now have to address race. Now I will write about race, and whereas I just think, it's around us in all of our lives all the time. And I don't know. There was something else I wanted to say. I don't know. I hope that the book reflects race beautifully and racism, and engages racism complexly, and I hope that it's not like ever explicitly performative.
The real quick story, when I'm a lot older than you, and when I was growing up in Louisville, I was in public school. I was at Barrett Junior High School. You may know Barrett. And when I was in the 7th grade, Louisville integrated their schools. And integration in 1963, I think this was, what that meant, this was right before they passed the Civil Rights Act. What they did was they drew an imaginary line right down the middle of Barrett Junior High School, and all the black kids had their classes on one side of the line, and all the white kids had their classes on the other side, and that was integration. I mean, talk about in between. Louisville's caught in the middle on everything, and they messed that one up. I can tell you that.
My mother would have been in elementary school then.
Yeah, it was not a good time. Things that didn't work very well. I can assure you of that.
I think like I'm just more worried about like there seems to only be like these certain ways to write about race. That's like these certain acceptable, explicitly performative ways. And I'm thinking like, when I'm thinking about this narrative, I'm thinking like, my mother is a working class white woman. She's also working at the country club in the same position as my father. This is how they meet. And I'm sort of more interested in the intersections of those kind of things. And then how that working class white resentment, it interacts with my, like for my grandfather, interacts with my Black father, even though they're kind of like in the same socioeconomic situation. So, I just want to like open up the complexity of it a little bit, and not necessarily camouflage it, or like, I hope that the effect isn't that it isn't legible, but that it's just like not the trite like conversation we keep having about it.
Oh, it certainly isn't trite. I can assure you that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your grandfather? And you don't have to if you don't want to.
He was like my first caretaker, the person I was first closest to. He probably is a big reason I started to write poems, because I started to write them very early. Like as a 7, 8. And I often think about like all the activities I did with him that probably informed me becoming a poet. But mostly my mother was at work, so I would, with him alone, I would be working puzzles, playing board games, like all these old kind of traditional things, and watching boxing and martial arts movies. But I really think like the puzzles and the games, these old-fashioned kind of things we did, really kind of informed the way I look at poetry, which is like a poem is like a puzzle to be figured out, to something to be crafted with these different moving parts. But my grandfather grew up on a dairy farm, I believe, in Custer, Kentucky, born in like 1925. And he moved to Louisville eventually. He delivered dry cleaning and drove a taxi. And I think he inherited the house behind the racetrack from his aunt. But by the time I came around, I believe he was retired. So he just had a bunch of little hobbies he did and games he played, and he looked after me, and he didn't want my father to be around. He was pretty traditionally racist and just like, didn't believe in interracial coupling and that sort of thing. So,
well, that figures big in your poetry, but you also, and as you just pointed it out, but you also show it in one of the things I love about your descriptions of your grandfather. The Hollywood version of a bigot, it's always black and white. If you're a bigot, you're a bad guy and you're entirely bad. If you're not a bigot, you're a good guy and you're entirely good. The picture we get of your grandfather is much more sophisticated than that. He's and that is one of the things. I grew up in Kentucky. I knew a fair number of bigots, and it's confusing sometimes, because just like anybody else, just because someone's bigoted doesn't mean they can't also sometimes be kind and generous. And that must have been really confusing for you as a child.
Part of my exploration into this is because he was explicitly racist, but also loved me very much. So he, as an adult, I look back and I see someone having an incredible internal conflict within themselves. And also by the end of his life, he ended up getting Alzheimer's, but he actually had a conversation with my dad towards the end of his life. And my dad also, who's an ordained minister, like ended up praying over him when he was in his last days, and they kind of like made up and everything. It was crazy. But before the Trump era, I would have said like now, like, I don't know what my like take on any of this is now, because unfortunately there are some pretty like racist in terms of like, I think what the larger society sees as racism is like racist violence and using the N-word and that sort of thing. There are people out there, as we know now, that still think that way. But I think more of what people don't like understand as racism, which I think is more important, is that racism is pretty much like kind of the air of the country, kind of the air of a country that hasn't really grappled with like head on like its history. And so it kind of is just something that's passed down like a name, and in these subtle ways where people don't, sometimes I think people don't even realize they harbor these racist sort of sentiments. And I sort of think of, racism as that kind of like wide sweeping fabric, and not like sort of the fringe violence that we've been seeing recently. But my grandfather, human beings are complex, and as a writer, my job is to write a multidimensional person who I think was a good man in some ways, and who loved me very much, but who also like believed that, and part of it I think was informed by his he had experience being poor over his life,
Sure.
and we grew up in a country where the mythology is that if you work hard, you can be whoever you want to be, and when that doesn't happen, and I think you're white, there can be some resentment about that. And so, he was great, and he loved me and everything, but he also believed himself to be superior to Black people. So, sure. As a person who comes, even, he lied. He wanted my mother to never tell me I was Black and for me to never meet my father. And he thought I was just going to be able to exist in society that way. As soon as my ass went to elementary school, it's like on. So it's like, that, that doesn't seem, I can imagine that to someone who isn't Black, he seems like a good person. But as I entered into the world as a Black person and got, feedback and social interaction from that, I realized how, harmful his views were. So
Sure.
complexity there,
Yeah. It, and I agree with you that it's an issue that is in the air and that we will always have to work with. But I think your poetry helps with that. I really do. Just poetry in general. As the library guy, I'm always trying to get people to read more, and I love poetry, so I'm always trying to get our patrons to read more poems. But when a lot of patrons, when I talk to them about it, they say, "Oh, I love prose. I love fiction and nonfiction, but poetry, I don't understand poetry, and it makes me feel stupid." And I have to admit, often when I'm reading poems in the New Yorker, I find myself going, "I don't have a clue what that's about," and it makes me feel stupid too. But what do you say to people who talk that way about poetry?
Well, I say I forgive you. It's not your fault. It's probably like no one taught you how to read it. I think we live in a society too where our entertainment is sort of automatic. Like we go to a movie theater, we sit down in a seat, and we wait to be entertained. We read a well-written fiction story, a narrative that follows a conventional structure that we're used to, and we're entertained. We don't have to do much work. Poetry asks you to work and bring work to the page. Like, in poetry, I really do think I sometimes teach workshops about, just start with like how to read poetry, especially when I'm teaching like an intro to poetry workshop, how to read poetry. And it's like, the first thing that you don't do is try to understand it. Like, that's not the point. And, it's something that you don't just read one time, you read it over and over again. But to me, it's just a matter of like how to read poems, what to look for. It's more like putting together a puzzle than going to watch a movie. So if your brain is more oriented to like sitting down to work out a 1,000 piece puzzle than sitting down to watch like Talladega.
Gong Show.
What'd you say?
But the Gong Show.
Yeah. Then you'll probably be into poetry, but I really do think there's a deficit in terms of like learning how to read it, being taught how to read it. It's just a different genre and it has different conventions, and you have to come to it differently. So
I'm really glad you're teaching people about that. I owe my love of poetry to poets like you who took the time to explain to my poor dim brain how poetry works. And it's worth the effort. I can tell you that for sure. Do your poems spring full blown from your mind, or do you walk around with them for a while and live with them? How does that happen?
Oh, that's not how it works. I don't even like. I don't know anymore. Like I'm kind of far away from the compositional process. Like I've written maybe 3 or 4 poems this year, but I'm not really consistently writing right now. I can't wait for everyone to leave me alone so I can write poetry again. But just me, like, I like blocked off the next month. Like I don't want to talk to anybody. I just want to figure out how to write poems again. But I think like each poem is different. There's like, you can't know, like that you don't just like ultimately figure it out one day and be like, oh, I know how to write poems now. And then just like, each poem requires its own thing. So, I don't know. I don't really have some, well constructed answer about process. I just get them from everywhere. But mostly what I've been doing is I just write down lines, just, keep a line notebook. And sometimes, it's kind of like catching the spirit, like you get a line and you get to going and you can just like riff off that for a while. And then you get to a place where your pen stops and you're like, well, what do I write next? And that's usually like, it's just trying to find that ride, trying to get on that ride and not get off.
Oh, that's terrific. You talk about your poetry a lot as if it were music, and of course, it is very musical. I like that. That's terrific. And I should explain. I think I mentioned at the beginning of this that you're in graduate school. I'm sure that's one of the reasons you're having so much trouble spending the time writing. But how are you doing? I mean, And on top, it's hard enough to be a poet in the world today and try to make a living, but you're in graduate school and you're doing all of this while there's a huge pandemic going on. How are you managing?
Um, I think I've almost made it through this semester. You know, I mean, not too well, honestly. I knew it was going to be rough. I knew that my book was going to come out the first semester of my PhD. I'm very neurotic and organized though. Like I keep like 5 lists, and I usually work better when I'm super busy. I'm like in my master's program, I got the award for like most likely hardest worker in every room or something like that. And so usually I just function that way. But this has been insurmountable, kind of like, you know, I was kind of anticipating, like I said, the book coming out first semester PhD, but the pandemic really disrupted me cognitively. It's like my memory, my ability to keep a schedule. So it's been really challenging. And then the book ended up being more successful than I expected. Not expected, but just, you know, that more than you can reasonably expect or hope for. And so I've been doing a ton of readings, so maybe like 3 a week on an average, on top of classes and, you know, the reading that the PhD requires, and interviews and everything. So it's been really overwhelming. It's demand, like the demand that I think people maybe are just sitting around and not as busy as usual, but the demand in my email has been really intense, and it just feels, I've never wanted to be a hermit so bad. I'm a very outgoing writer, not outgoing like compared to like most humans, but like compared to other writers, I'm pretty outgoing. And now I just want to be alone, you know, but
Sure.
I just had sick this past week. I'm trying to get through finals. It's been a lot. So I really think it's the pandemic and not like, you know.
Sure. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Are we interrupting your preparation for finals? My God.
Well, I was supposed to be done last week, but then I got sick.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I should mention, poor Joy is got a head cold. We hope it's not COVID-19. So she's very kindly talking with us, even though she doesn't feel well. And I'm afraid we're now running toward the end of our time, allotted time. But I would like to give people the opportunity to hear one more poem by you. It's another one of my favorites. They're all my favorites in your book. And I may not pronounce this right, so correct me if I pronounce it wrong. Could you read Abecedarian for Alzheimer's?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk with you, by the way, even though I'm sick. I just am kind of sad I don't have as much energy as I usually do.
You're doing really well.
So it's Abecedarian for Alzheimer's. And this is funny because my dad, he's like, you know, my biggest fan. And every week he's been calling me. He actually does have COVID right now. So prayers up for him. But I think he's through the worst of it. But he had been calling me every week with like a new favorite poem. And one week he called and he said, I love this Abecedarian. You know, and so an Abecedarian is a received form, which is to say like an established form of a poem. And what it is each successive line begins with the letter of the alphabet, so A through Z. And so you can listen for that if you want. Abecedarian for Alzheimer's. Angel was my papa's girlfriend when he died. Back there in my memory, I hear my mother fussing about condoms and age. She is saying the girl is only 25 and Black. My daddy, amused at the irony of racism, whispering to me, he's at his end anyway. Angel was stripping at Deja Vu when he moved her into the front bedroom, and this is where I began to realize what precisely was going on. He couldn't remember me, but by then he was forgetting who he was too. Outside the club next to our world famous horse racing track, the infamous sign read, Win Place Show Bar, 99 pretty girls and one ugly one. A jab at Angel, their only dark-skinned dancer. She mystified them with her kaleidoscope of color contacts and quick weaves. They loved her equine legs. I loved her for telling my secret loud, for making a messy joke of him and my mother the way I felt they had made a mess of me. After Angel moved in, I never saw him again. My mother avoided his street. She could not get over the hypocrisy, how he disowned her when I was born, then made her promise not to speak of my Blackness, my father, to me. Buried hole of quiet lies they dug for years before it opened beneath the two of us and ruined everything. Maybe my mother envied Angel because she saw the truth of him out. And when he began forgetting to hate us, to put his white hood on every day, Angel used him the proper way. I like to think of her as Veritas, the goddess at the bottom of that empty well, naked and holding a hand mirror. Or maybe it was me, a xeric unblooming thing down there beneath them. I had for years been taught to live that way. Black, unassuming, zipped up in history, a disease not even progress can cure.
That's an incredible poem. When I came across it, I was sitting in front of the fire and I read it, and I read it again and I read it again, and I'm still reading it. It's a fabulous poem, and it sort of sums up the whole book. I just want to say, Joy, your poetry, your poems, the subject of your poems is often sad, often difficult, and yet they're unrelentingly beautiful, your poems. I mean, just beautiful. And that beauty gives me hope. It gives me the belief in the possibilities of the future. The fact that Kentucky, in my hometown, my home city, produced someone as remarkable as you makes me very happy. I want everyone that's watching this to go out and buy a copy of Horsepower, okay? You can get it on Amazon. It's a great book. It'll make a terrific Christmas present. And Joy, thank you so much for being with us today. You got to promise me you will never stop writing.
Oh no, I can't do that. My body doesn't react well.